Okay, as we slowly come back, I'm going to read something by Ben King, he was alive from 1857 to 1894. It is from an incomplete history of St. Joe County, Aaron's book, one of his books. Where the bumblebee sips when the clover is red, and the zephyrs come laden with peach blow perfume, where the thistledown pauses in search of the rose, and the myrtle and woodbine and wild ivy grows, where the catbird pipes up, and it sounds most divine, off there in the branches of some lonely pine. Oh, give me the spot that I once used to know by the side of the placid old River St. Joe. Good choice, I believe, for a very engaging book. Aaron Helman is an author, adventurer, humorist, historian, and taco enthusiast, born and raised in South Bend, Indiana. He's a proud graduate of LaSalle High School and an author of An Incomplete History of St. Joseph County, Indiana, and Ride the Jackrabbit, and his books have been featured on WNIT, WVPE, WNDU, WSBT, and in the South Bend Tribune. As communications director at the Community Foundation, his day job sees him working with dozens of terrific nonprofits throughout St. Joseph County. He's married to Ashley, and they have 4 children between the ages of 10 and 17. Aaron.
Hey, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
It is great to be with you. Barb really crushed that introduction, didn't she? Yeah, give her a round of applause. So my name is Aaron. I am a proud graduate of LaSalle High School. I'm married to Ashley over here, and I'm the author of 2 local history books. Before all that, I was a youth pastor and a preacher in the local church for almost 20 years. And the common thread that runs through all of my experiences is that I've always been fascinated by opportunities to learn about how what happened still influences what is happening. In fact, even though I didn't recognize it at the time, I think there's an incredible bit of poetry when I remember the most recent sermon I gave before this one. I was at a church on the north side of South Bend, March 2022. I had the privilege of sharing the stories of 3 apostles of Jesus who never spoke in the Bible. In all 4 gospel accounts, they exist in name only, but are given no lines. They're extras. You could play these guys in a movie without a SAG card. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit, and if you're not a Christian or not even a theist, don't worry. None of this comes from the Bible because they're not really in it. It's going to come from history and tradition. It's wild to me. Matthew, Mark, and John in the Bible spent most of their most important years in their life hanging out with these 3 unquoted dudes, and somehow they did not think to include so much as a single word that any of them ever said. If they had a scene, it was cut. If they had a line, it was skipped. And if they had a moment, it was forgotten. But what's most fascinating to me as a historian is the idea that just because someone is lost to popular history does not mean that they are uninteresting or unimportant. In fact, I usually find that it's the opposite. So if you'll indulge me for just a few minutes, I want to share just a little bit about the 3 non-speaking apostles. Their names were Simon the Zealot, James the Lesser, and Matthias, because even though to Christians they seem relatively unimportant, the tradition states that their lives have impacted hundreds of thousands, even millions of people in ways they couldn't have imagined, and in ways that I think will be instructive for us to consider. Simon the Zealot is the most unknown of the apostles. Not only does he not speak, he never even gets a verb attached to his name in a sentence. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't follow or weep or listen or protest or sit or anything. He only exists in the instances where the apostles are listed in their tiny little census. And yet, in the years after the resurrection of Jesus, Simon becomes the first bishop of Jerusalem. Tradition holds that he becomes a major player in the first religious war that lands in Jerusalem after the time of Jesus. And I'm sure I don't need to explain to you how those kinds of conflicts continue to echo through to this day. I know it seems like an outsized influence to ascribe to a man who many of you hadn't heard of before today, but I'm not done yet. Tradition places this very same Simon as the first evangelist to Britain, the first person to bring Christianity to the English, the first beatings of a butterfly's wings that would set off a ripple effect that would some 2,000 years later determine the United States as a so-called Christian nation, for better and for worse. And in case you're thinking that maybe we don't talk about Simon the Zealot very much because maybe his life was just pretty boring, maybe I should take a moment to tell you how tradition says he died. They say he was martyred when his enemies sawed him in half, vertically. Let's move on to something more cheerful. On to the other James, the non-speaking James, an apostle so wildly unimportant to biblical writers that they literally call him James the Lesser. We know arguably less about him than we do Simon the Zealot, and even the canonical traditions about him are sparser, but we do know that James, the Lesser, mind you, wound up evangelizing throughout Egypt, and that the Christian church in Egypt today, serving some 11 million people, trace their roots to this James. Not a bad legacy for a guy with no surviving quotes. But then there's my favorite. It's this guy, Matthias. This guy wasn't even present at the Last Supper. He didn't become a member of the 12 apostles until after. See, the tradition holds that after Judas's betrayal and eventual downfall, the apostles were down to 11, and they needed to add one more to their ranks. So they literally draw straws, and Matthias is chosen to join them. And that's all they tell us about him. Until centuries later, when the Catholic Church officially names Matthias as the patron saint of Gary, Indiana. Now, I could guess as to why they chose Matthias as the patron saint of Gary, Indiana, but I have no desire for conjecture, and I certainly don't want to disparage the good people of Gary, Indiana. So I will say what I say next as a statement of fact only, and let you do with it what you will. Matthias, substitute apostle of Jesus, in the years after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, was the one chosen by his peers to go and evangelize in a place called the City of Cannibals. Stories like this one are why I love history so much. I love discovering people and events that I haven't heard of, or even that most people haven't heard of. I love being able to discover their stories. I love being able to share them. And I love seeing how people react to them. But I'm a local historian, not a biblical scholar. And even though it took me just one step to get from unspeaking Christian apostles to Gary, Indiana, we've still got 60 miles from Gary to here before we wound up in South Bend. And that's what we're going to do next, because for me, the history of St. Joseph County, Indiana, of all places, is just as fascinating as the history of minor biblical players. And as far as how the course of my life has turned out, it's just as important. I don't say that to be flippant or to minimize the role of Jesus and the apostles, but the people who did the work of those apostles in my life, the people who shared faith and hope and love with me, they came from here. Every detail would be wildly different. Every detail of my life would be wildly different if this place didn't exist. And that takes me to the spot where my grandparents are buried in a cemetery near Pinhook Park at the southernmost point on the St. Joseph River, which is the southernmost River that flows to Lake Michigan, a place without which none of this would be here, and neither would any of us. See, once upon a time, before steamboats traversed the Mississippi and before trains crisscrossed the North American continent, it was canoes that delivered commerce and people across the New World. Loaded down with men and merchandise and guns and goods, canoes were the easiest and the safest way to get across the continent. After all, it's easier to float things than it is to carry them. But what happens when one waterway isn't connected to another? What happens when you need to get to a place serviced by one river to a place serviced by another? You have to carry your things. We call that a portage. You have to find a portage, and you have to hope it's not a very long portage, because carrying a boat filled with stuff is unpleasant, to say the least. This is probably not a problem you've ever thought about, because understanding watersheds isn't a skill that we need anymore. But this is important, because every waterway north and east of the St. Joseph River belongs to the Great Lakes watershed. You could explore those rivers as much as you want, but eventually they're all going to dump you out into one of the Great Lakes. They'll never take you further west. They'll never take you further south. Fortunately, from the spot on the pinhook of the St. Joseph River, it was just a 4-mile hike to connect from that waterway to the nearest banks of the Kankakee River. The Kankakee River is part of the Mississippi watershed that comprises 40% of the landmass of the continental United States and drains parts of 31 states. What we're talking about here is a 4-mile walk from roughly the corner of Portage and Boland Streets to the corner of Mayflower and Sample Streets. It's a geographic curiosity, and it's important flapping of an important butterfly in the chain reaction that becomes this city in our lives, because when European settlers would put down roots roughly where we are right now, it was because that 4-mile walk was the shortest possible distance between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed. They set up shop here because once upon a time this was the crossroads of the New World, and besides 100 more aspirational reasons to set up a town at a place like this one, it was also a very good place to make money. So someone was always going to put a town here. But it's also the who that did put a town here that becomes so important. Because as soon as I say it, you're going to recognize the outsized influence of this man who is still directing the largest economic engine in South Bend, Indiana. And that's because Alexis Coquillard, founder of South Bend, was a devout Catholic, was well connected in his diocese, and was highly, highly supportive of Catholic religious education. Whether you root for them or you don't, we all recognize that the city that we live in today is a drastically different place if the University of Notre Dame is not located here. In the same way that the Christianization of the British echoes through our lives even today, we can also say that if the founders of South Bend had been Bavarian Lutherans, for example, this would be a different town and we would all have different lives. And so the butterfly flaps his wings. But not every flap is a good one. A handful of good decisions by the Studebakers and the Olivers built industry in our city. A handful of bad ones by Albert Erskine brought it all down. In my newest book, I chased down the seemingly small steps that helped legitimize the Hungarian community in South Bend, including when a Hungarian-American soldier from the south side of town fired the first American shot in World War I and became a massive celebrity and war hero. I also tackle the ways that Cass County, Michigan, once upon a time the most racially progressive place in America, has slid away from what it used to be, courtesy of the flapping of a malevolent butterfly's wings. I could go on and on about the consequences of the Polish Revolution of 1830 and the ways that that's influenced the course of my life, even though I'm not Polish. That's because Poland lost their Revolutionary War. They were decimated and conquered by Russia, and there was a mass exodus from the country toward the promise of the new world. And as it so happened, the defeated Polish came pouring into America at the same time that Studebaker was hiring dozens and dozens of workers every single day. Those Poles found work and constructed homes and built the west side of town where my mom was raised and where I went to elementary, middle, and high schools. So I wrote a chapter about that too. Butterflies flap their wings, and if the Polish people win a war on the other side of the globe 150 years before I am ever born, my life turns out different. I find history fascinating because I want to find out how things that happened then and there are still affecting what is happening now and here. And I find history instructive because it demonstrates how the things that happen now and here will influence the things that happen later and everywhere. And that's what makes every single choice that you and I make so important. You and I may be forgotten to history, but the impact of your life will not be. The people you influence, the things you build, the love you give, the example you set, all of it spills into the future for longer than you could ever imagine. I'm fortunate to work at a place like the Community Foundation of St. Joseph County, where we hold literal endowments. People give sums of money to be saved and invested in perpetuity, and every year we pay the interest income to worthy nonprofit organizations in St. Joseph County. It's the most literal demonstration of the way that a person's decision can pay dividends for decades beyond their lifetime. But life isn't about money. The skills you teach your grandchildren, the example you set for your coworkers, the graciousness you show a neighbor, the work that you do to break down racial, religious, and socioeconomic barriers, the history that you live that someone a lot like me might write down 100 years from now. That's what I'm really excited about. I'm going to stick around for a while after we're done here. I've got books to sell and sign because I got to pay bills, and God knows I want to hear your local history stories and talk to you a little bit. But I also am interested in local future stories. So think about that. Think about what came before you, what's happening around you right now, and how you want the world to look different because you were in it. It's a big world, and the flap of your butterfly wings might seem small and insignificant, but you can take it from someone who has done the research. Your life is going to have an impact. You never know which choice you make is the one that's going to shape someone else's future. So with as much as you can and as often as you can, try to make each choice the best one. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.